So, why are we here? There's been this monthly Saturday morning ritual that we did partake on in 2023. At 7 a.m., we wake up and we get on Zoom and we meet and talk with a bunch of other like-minded folks. So, Emeka, what is Africa Deep Tech Community, and why have we been doing what we have been doing, and how is the experiment going for you?
Oh man, that is a packed question. To be honest, I don't have an answer because it's still evolving, right, every day. But I can tell you what the idea is, right? I think ultimately the idea is that if you have a group of like-minded people who are passionate about a particular thing in the room, sharing ideas and just sharing their thoughts, their dreams, aspirations, frustrations about a particular topic, over time, magic is going to happen, right? That's really the premise. And for the Africa Deep Tech community, it is basically a space that we created to have conversations around deep tech for Africa by Africans, right? With the goal of educating ourselves and inspiring ourselves around what the possibilities are for deep tech in the region. Basically that's it. And for those who may be listening, who may not know what we're referring to by deep tech, it has been referred to by several names. You could call it research-based technology, emerging technologies. I heard somebody say it was a technology that seemed impossible yesterday, that is barely possible today, and is certainly going to be possible tomorrow, right? Or something like that, right? So with everything going on, we've got generative AI, augmented reality, IoT, blockchain. Question is, where is Africa in all of this? How can we leverage these technologies? How can we even be the ones creating some of these technologies? And how can we actually shape the future of what the technology landscape is? And so ADTC is just a group of like-minded people who gather every month to share thoughts and have conversations around this. At least that's what it is today. Who knows? If we have this conversation in a year's time, maybe saying something different.
The spirit of ADTC started as a trickle-down of an article that you, Emeka, published titled, "What if the internet was invented by Africa by Africans?" Which is something that brings us together, but also brings me and Baba together, because that's kind of, that I remember like our very first conversation, one-on-one conversations that were all about this exact question. What if the internet was invented by Africans? And kind of when you start to peel the layers, you realize that the internet hasn't been serving Africans well because it wasn't designed with the constraints of Africa in mind. And like for me, for example, I wasn't exposed to this until I moved to the US. I was like, oh wow, the infrastructure here is actually very different, and it allows for certain things to come to life because they were designed with this in mind. And so kind of, for example, if you look at social media, it is just an artifact of randomness that it's still used in Africa the same way as the rest of the world. And you start to wonder, like, why hasn't been there, either reverse innovation, so like ideas that are started in the continent, or what are the types of innovations that would serve the continent from within? When it comes to deep tech, there's a risk that we would never be at the frontier of innovation if the expected behavior is always, we're just going to wait for innovation to come from elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. Like, this is something that had been on my mind for years, right? So a huge part of my career had been around building ecosystems, mainly working for, big tech companies or tech companies. And it had always been around, driving adoption or growing ecosystems around their technologies, right? Either in Africa or emerging markets like the Middle East or, other similar emerging markets, or so-called emerging markets as they're called. And it quickly became obvious that there was always some friction, right, in driving this adoption. And I've always asked myself, why is that? And one hypothesis that came to me was, simply culture, right? Like, it's when it comes to not just tech, but any invention, right? If you really look at any technology, right? Technology is basically, or innovation and technology is basically somebody figuring out a way to solve a problem in their lives. Okay. So the question then is, whose life and what problem, right? And so you realize very quickly that it's tough to separate the resulting technology from the culture that created it, like the culture of the people or the way of life of those people that created it, And so, yeah, when you look at it that way, from that perspective, you begin to figure out, oh, maybe that is why there's always this friction in technology adoption when you're talking about a lot of these emerging market or rest of the world countries with regards these new technologies. Whereas if you look at other technologies that they have adopted or even created, right, or innovations that they've done themselves, the adoption is just like that, right, because it fits into their way of life. And I can give a number of examples. And you probably saw this yourself in your own journey. In Nigeria, when mobile phones came to Nigeria, the way you could check your credit or check your account balance or your airtime was by using the USSD. You dial star 123 or star whatever, and that became the way that most people used to communicate with the service provider outside making calls and sending SMS, right? And so fast forward a few years later, when internet banking becomes a thing, the banks tried a lot to drive adoption of their mobile banking apps that you could use to transfer money or check your balance and do all those things. And yeah, there was good adoption, but that adoption never went down to the grassroots. And then some banks then figured out that, hey, you could create an interface where you could use USSD to do the same thing, right? You could use the USSD protocol to check your balance. You could use the USSD protocol to transfer money and do a bunch of other stuff. And almost overnight, and I heard this from a banker, that the number of transactions happening over USSD eclipsed all the transactions happening across all their banking channels. This is both internet banking, mobile app, ATM, right? It has eclipsed all of them almost overnight. And I'm asking myself, why is this? It was simply because, this is a technology that was part of the way of life of the people. And adoption was just like that. The whole M-Pesa thing in Kenya also is another example of that, right? So it's difficult to separate the way of life from the technology. And so if you agree with that and you step back and you ask yourself, what if some of these technologies that we take for granted today were invented or created by Africans from scratch based on their own way of life? Would it be the same? How would it look? How would it function? How would the interface be? And please feel free to stop me. I can talk about this stuff for hours. I can give multiple examples. You can look at the internet today as it exists is mainly text-based, for example, right? And you could attribute that to the fact that the World Wide Web, or the World Wide Web, let me not just say the internet, the World Wide Web is mainly text-based. And that could be attributed to the fact that the creator of the World Wide Web was an academician, right? Doing a project at CERN, right? And it was all about how you can connect documents and find documents and link documents and stuff like that. Now, what if the person who created the World Wide Web was a musician? How would
and just be cheaper to transfer text than to transfer audio files or to transfer video when the internet infrastructure was still 56 kbps modems, so kind of like it was forced to start from text. And yes, to your point, like that meant that only certain categories of people could actually interact with that type of technology. You would have to learn or have some English proficiency and be lucky enough to have exposure to a computer and so on and so forth, which is almost trivialized when you get to look at the word from kind of like from macro scale. Like those nuances are lost in the details because big tech, which is kind of always going to be the leading innovator, or like big companies are always going to be leading innovators because how much funding they can throw at the problems or by the potential problem solvers, you end up with an outlook that just looks at where the money is flowing and not necessarily where the future value can be created. And like case in point is there's like nobody cares to understand why there isn't a lot of commerce coming from certain countries because there is no commerce coming from those countries. But the moment you dive just first layer and ask the question, like, why isn't there enough value there or value coming into the company from those places, you realize that it's just simple as just understanding that there is value add in enabling certain use cases, monetary or others. And those things are kind of like lost in translation. So kind of no one cares to solve the problem.
And you could even ask yourself, what's your definition of value, right? And how are you looking at value? Again, I can give another example. When I grew up in Nigeria, right? And Nigeria got mobile phones sometime around 2002, 2001, early 2000s. And before, the general thinking was that if you looked at Nigeria's GDP, right? Or whatever the economic stats that the more knowledgeable folks look at, that there was no way Nigeria could sustain mobile. Like people wouldn't be able to afford mobile phones, wouldn't be able to buy airtime. Like just looking at the GDP alone, based on whatever statistics existed at that time, that Nigeria couldn't support a mobile ecosystem, right? But as it turned out, a lot of Nigeria's wealth, quote unquote, or value is not captured in the GDP numbers, right? And so, because it's captured in the informal sector, right? And so a lot of the big mobile players backed off from Nigeria as a market. They didn't come to bid for licenses in Nigeria. But the few mobile operators that braved it and came in over a period of a decade, MTN to be precise, for example, is now the largest mobile operator in the continent, mainly powered from the growth they got out of the Nigerian market. Right? And so the question is, how are you measuring that value? How are you defining that value? And that's the thing, like bringing it back to the deep tech conversation and technology. Like the folks who create the technology would understand how the value flows in that ecosystem and would obviously create it in line with that, right? So if you have an internet ecosystem that is built on, say, advertising revenue, credit card system, post office system that works, an addressing system, where or a place where like the address is probably your home address is probably the most important thing because that's what drives your social security number and every other thing and powers your credit score and so on and so forth. That is the internet ecosystem we have today. So if you take that ecosystem and move it to a place like, I guess, Nigeria, Morocco, Kenya, right? So where, for example, the addressing system as exists here is non-existent in Nigeria or in Kenya, right? I know that in Kenya, as at 2010, house numbering system was not a thing. That's not just how the place works, right? So if you take an internet ecosystem that works based on the fact that everybody has a billing address, right, where with their credit card and credit card statement and so on and so forth, and move it to a place like Kenya, where there's no house numbering system, right? Then you're like, oh, like the internet, there's no value in Kenya. That's what you could say, right? There's no value in Kenya. Whereas the thing is, the system that you're trying to use there doesn't fit. Okay. Then what then happens overnight? M-Pesa happens, right? M-Pesa is a way to do the same thing, to transact and do all this stuff, but you don't need a house number, to do it. You don't need a social security number. All you need is a phone number, a different way of thinking about it. And all of a sudden, all this value is unlocked almost from thin air. Okay. And the whole picture changes. So the point is, to my earlier point, like when you create a technology based on your way of life, you're going to your point, like you're going to get more value from that. More value is going to create. It's going to be apparent because you know what you created it for and you had that end goal in mind. Versus trying to retrofit something from somewhere else.
Yeah, and it's much more likely to connect multiple dots that are much closer to home. That wouldn't be easily discoverable by an external observer. Like let's say a PM from TikTok wanting to launch a shopping feature for Kenya. Like, yeah, good luck understanding how the commerce culture works because you're not embedded. So like if you're not solving from the ecosystem, yeah, it might solve, but would that solution be the most optimal solution for the problem? Unlikely.
Exactly. I've seen that over and over and over again, right? I can keep giving examples. The Kenya example I gave is just one. Anybody who has been in any informal sector in Africa will tell you that, for example, you walk into any market, there's a way things work in that place. And if you're trying to automate, let's say you showed up in Alaba International Market, for example, in Lagos, and you're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to automate your systems with SAP or whatever. You for a very long thing, as they say, right? But now you could then translate that to mean that, oh, Alaba International Markets can never be automated, right? That's one interpretation you could take away from, right? But if you got somebody who is from the space, who understands technology, who can build, and not just understands technology from maybe at the app level, like, oh, which app is going to work, but understands it from first principles and says, okay, this is the problem we're trying to solve. How can we solve it? Whether it's by, I don't know, smoke signals, USSD, using the internet, building my own device, that where the form factor fits the way these traders interact or whatever. Like if you have somebody who's thinking from first principles in that space, you're most likely to come up with a solution that works, right? The challenge is that the people who are thinking in that mindset, right, a lot of times they don't have either the opportunity to make those ideas happen. Sometimes they don't think that those ideas are valid, right, because they haven't read about it on the internet, or they haven't seen it on TV, or somebody else hasn't said, oh, this is a valid idea, right? And so that's part of what ADTC is, right? A space where people who are thinking along those lines can come and have a safe conversation of, hey, these are some things I've been playing with. These are things I'm thinking about. These are problems I've seen, and these are a way we could solve it from first principles in a judgment-free zone, in a curious, where there's curiosity about what you're trying to do, and where people are actually like trying to understand and validate what you're doing. And that gives you the courage to press on, and do more and figure out more and stay curious and fail and not be ashamed and stuff like that, which is basically how the internet was built. The internet that we're using today was built, except that was in a different geography, right? So how can we do the same thing in Africa? That's the question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And for me, I think learning about ADTC and working with you guys on it, I think for me, my thesis still happens to be the same. Is like the African innovation framework is broken. But I don't think this is it's a unique problem to Africa. However, I think the impact being Africa is one of the places where I think this framework is like sorely missing. But from my own particular analysis, I think it's a problem between people who actually have valid experience that can innovate or put some ideas or put some innovation muscle energy behind some of these things and matching them to those type of problems. So I think for me, my hope is like the ADTC community can serve as a breeding ground for matching different type of innovators. So there are a lot of Africans who actually have experience, but they're living in other geographies. So if they can be able to bring what they have to the table and also merge that with like Africans who are also like local and have a different perspective of what it requires to innovate locally in their geographies. And if we have this mesh of conversations going across the spectrum, then hopefully, the innovation cycle, the virtuous loop of innovation can hopefully focus some attention to our communities back home.
Any of you have any predictions for African tech in 2024?
Oh my goodness. I know Baba has some ideas, so.
No, it's very challenging to predict what 2024 can look like, right? So I don't know about 2024, but for me, it's long term, right? So one particular technology that back to what a group like ADTC offers was, thanks largely to Emeka, I didn't even know someone like Zak existed, right? And this is me living in the Bay. We're both in the Bay, but without Emeka, there's probably no way our paths would have come across each other. And I don't know anyone in my circle that can have a conversation like, oh my God, I think Africans should build a space station. And the person will be like, oh yeah. Like he's not surprised by some of these like wild ideas that I come up with. And it's very refreshing to have that kind of validation because otherwise you are left in a loop whereby you're looking at yourself and you're saying to yourself, oh, okay, this type of ideas cannot be solved like by people that either look like me or come from where I come from. So having this loop whereby you feel safe to share whatever crazy idea you have, I think that's been very helpful. Going into like the short-term future, AI is definitely something probably I've bet my career on in several epochs, and I still think for sure it's still the thing I think will be it's the next wave of computing, right? And I think I definitely see a future where folks would be talking to their computers in their native languages or in languages using like voice and stuff. But it's challenging that something fundamental like this is, or something that to me feels fundamental and monumental, is not being paid enough attention on, right? So just think about it. if talking to computers is the way we program, right? And the only or the best interface for talking to computers is in the English language. How does that look like for Africa, right? And using the current paradigm, we're saying not just English language, but English language with a particular dialect, with the Americanized dialect and an accent, right? So I'm sure a lot of folks in Africa have tried to use some of these devices, and they can see it doesn't recognize the accent. Do you understand? Or and we see the value of a computer, like how computing has literally changed the landscape of the world. If that kind of weight or that kind of force is only being able to be interacted by just one language, or it's like, let's say when I'm using English, I can do anything and anything, and when I go to my native language, I can't even do like calculator stuff, right? How does that look like? How does the global innovation spectrum look like if that's the world we're moving into? So for me, I definitely see a future whereby the interface of computing in terms of like language, not just English, is definitely, I see a future whereby a lot of African languages, or popular African languages, are also being used to interact with computers. And one other thing that you start to see when I think as Africans we start looking at problems with an African lens or from an African framework as well, you start to see that actually some unique solutions to African problems can actually be shared globally, right? But anyways, so prediction for 2024, I don't have none, but AI in African languages is going to be huge, and it's going to be helpful to help Africans interact better with technology.
So when you say African languages, just to understand, is the current problem a data availability problem? As in, do we need to actually start producing as much content as was produced in the English majority internet over the past 50 years in order to have a seat at the table? Or what would be a practical way to bridge the gap? If there is a gap, I don't know if there's a gap.
I think that's an interesting question. To me, I think it's an innovation problem. And by that, I don't have an answer. I'll start with saying that. But why I think, and that's why I think it's an innovation problem, not necessarily a data problem. When I started looking at this space like 3-4 years ago, I also had the perspective that it was a data problem. But then you start to like read all the research papers, and you start to see that actually a lot of the research, a lot of the data structures that are being used to train machine learning models to understand speech and NLP, all of that still boils down to a lot of text, right? And so fundamentally, by using text as the interface or as the input for training the models, fundamentally puts a lot of African language, not just, I'm not saying like local African or non-local, I'm not saying languages that are not that spoken. I'm saying well-spoken African languages will not be on the same par when you just say, okay, text, when you're using text as the representation you're going to use as an artifact of that language to train the model. So, for example, if you go to like Yoruba, Igbo, these are languages spoken by at least, even, okay, maybe not Hausa, but Yoruba, Igbo, spoken individually by at least 40 million people each. And so these are, I'm not saying, and that's why I don't like the term low resource languages. These are languages that are spoken by a lot of people. It's just that the medium in which these languages evolved from, these languages are said to be oral languages by nature. And minus that, there's a lot of global advancements that other languages have that a lot of African languages don't have. So when you talk about English, for example, when you have all this like European Parliament and World WHO, United Nations meetings and briefings, a lot of them exist in English and are translated to like several European languages as well, right? So all that data exists for training, right? And they exist probably somewhere on the internet. But still on the internet, though, there is a lot of data when you look at African languages. It's just that it's not based on text. If you go on YouTube now, there's a lot of videos on Yoruba, people speaking Igbo, but the research focus is based on text. And this is like, we're talking of research everywhere in the industry. Using speech as the basis of building models, back then when I started was probably a handful of researchers, but now the number has risen, right? So, and thanks a lot to like the fact that, I'm sorry to say, but the global innovation landscape of AI is not just dominated by the West alone. So you have folks in China or India in the East as well who have similar challenges with that. Or their languages have similar patterns to African languages. For example, you have Chinese languages who also happen to be tonal. So like definitely a model that is able to support like tonal recognition, like China, would be a bit more suited to like African languages like Yoruba and Igbo than something like completely Western like English or French. So yeah, so it's not really that the data doesn't exist. What's it? It's an innovation problem. I don't think there's been enough, like Emeka said, thinking through first principles. There's not been enough attention to this problem from a standpoint of someone who really cares. It's like, okay, if I really want to solve this problem, and okay, this particular method is not going to solve it, how can I rethink or reframe the problem so that I can make more progress, right? So that's also the opportunity, though. That's also the opportunity, I must say.
Yeah, I mean, I like that. That's exactly like I said, but that's what I'm saying, right? If somebody who really cared about it had enough time to focus on it, or was able to focus on it for long enough, they would obviously figure out a way to do it without going through text, right? That way may not be obvious to us right now because maybe it doesn't exist or it's not matured, but it's about, how much focus has someone put on it. And that's the whole point of ADTC, right? Is a critical mass of people who care enough about this stuff to A, have the conversations around it, and B, do the work on it. And then let's see what we get. Is it in the AI space? Is it blockchain? Is it, and I'm coming to your question, Zach, of things that excite me going into the year. But yeah, in whatever space, are there enough people who are thinking about it? Or even people who have thought about it and who have come up with solutions? Have they been put into the limelight? That is a question. So I know people who built ways of training AI models offline on low-cost laptops in Nigeria as of 2018. But, did that project get the recognition I felt it deserved? Maybe not. So these are some of the conversations. To Zach's question, I can't say what is going to be hot in 2024, 2025. I can say what I want or what I would like to see. Better. Yeah. But what Baba said obviously was one. Like, I'm really excited about everything happening around AI and languages and generative AI now, because it means that, and maybe this is going to be a topic of another podcast, some of the devices we're seeing coming on board these days. It means that people are beginning to quickly realize that the current computer interface is limited. Like the current way of interfacing with computers, where you have to type, where there's an assumption that you have to be literate to communicate with the computer, right? It looks like that day is going to be behind us very soon, right?
For some languages.
Yeah. So, but at least the world is beginning to at least understand that. And hopefully we don't want Africans to be left behind in recognizing that. We don't want Africans to wait until 10 years later to realize, oh, wow, we could have also done this for ourselves, because this is the time, right? So it's obvious that the whole thing of text as an interface, or, punching buttons and being able to recognize symbols and text on an app or whatever as a way of interacting with the computer is not going to be around for forever, right? So there are now ways of inputs now through voice and so on. And that opens up a whole landscape. Imagine a world where a tomato seller in Marrakesh, right, is able to interact with Google and all the data and knowledge and information Google has the way you and I can, just because he or she knows how.
And in a way that will make sense to her as well.
And exactly. Right? That opens up a whole new world that nobody's even thinking about. Right? So that's one thing I'm excited about. Another thing I'm interested to see how it plays is the whole Web3 space. I know Web3 is like a dirty word for some people right now. But if you remove all the fluff around, like, crypto or, all that stuff, and look at the underlying technologies powering these things, it's very easy to see how these apply to the region, decentralization and all that kind of stuff. And a few people are already beginning to innovate in this direction. And I'm just excited to see all the possibilities around that as the technology gets faster and so on. right, and more scalable. So those are areas we could go on and talk about IoT and so on and so forth. I just wanted to mention those two.
So I have here Web3 AI devices, non-text interfaces, and AI broadly speaking. I mean, AI clearly was the thing for 2023. I'm pretty sure it's going to be still going for 2024, but there might be like a few reckonings that have to be done because the technology is still, I don't want to say nascent, but it's not production ready. I feel like it was thrown into the tumbler, and there's going to be a slight backlash for having used something or pumped something up to the moon without it having run the test of time.
What do you mean by production ready? I'm curious. Like when you say production ready, what does production ready AI look like?
Use cases, financials mostly. Financial, does it actually make sense in terms of computation to exist? Or is it just a cost that the VCs and Microsoft are incurring right now? That is still kind of, for me, it's one of the biggest questions. Like, does it actually make sense? Or is big tech still just paying for the mass experimentation and the mass data collection from people since ChatGPT was launched?
Interesting.
Because one way to look at kind of the current AI rat race is it's a race to collect as much data as possible in order to build those data flywheels. And the data flywheel is once you have done the initial human training, you no longer need humans. The human input that you get by just being exposed to people's input is enough to keep training those models on and on and on. And ChatGPT specifically has a huge head start that neither Bard, near Claude by Anthropic, near Pi, nor any model that I know of came even close to having that much data, to the point where models have been trained on GPT-4 output because that's the best output you can get for your dollar amount. And so again, like the question from a financial standpoint is, does it actually make sense, or are we nearing a total monopoly by Microsoft / OpenAI just because of the massive head start that they've gotten, and nobody ever would dethrone or can compete against GPT-4 or the latest OpenAI model just because of the head start? So kind of we are back at this weird point in time where like the game is still being designed, but it seems like there's already a case of very few winners take all, and whether and to what extent that is actually the case versus that's just incurring or willing to incur the losses short term in order to dominate the market long term.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been the name of the game, right? Like, while we're talking, the thing that came to mind was video on the internet, right? So YouTube, right? YouTube started, 2005? It didn't break even until sometime 2010, sometime between 2010 and 2012 or thereabout. That was when YouTube broke even in terms of cost of hosting and streaming video data, right? But I think from the get-go, there was some strong conviction, because at the time YouTube came out, I don't think the internet as a whole had enough infrastructure to sustain YouTube, like video streaming at scale at that time, right? And so the same thing you're talking about right now from a compute perspective, I think is what's playing out. But I think there's enough conviction that over time that's going to get better. Either find more efficient ways to do it, or the machines will get more powerful, or both. And that will not be, and so to your point, is a question of who grabs the market first, or who becomes number one, which is something like YouTube was able to do, right? So Google ate the cost of scaling YouTube just to make sure that if anybody anywhere in the world was thinking of a place to upload a video, YouTube would be the first thing that came to mind, right? And that has paid off. So, but it poses a challenge to everybody, and bringing it back onto Africa, like, what does that mean, for the region? Where are we investing, right? Like, I think it was Alex Sado who said to me once that if in this AI conversation, the way Alex put it for me was a very profound thing. He said that if data is the oil, if data is the new oil, then compute is the refinery, right? Is the oil refinery. And so where is all this oil being refined? And one interesting conversation for Africans and people who are interested in this deep tech conversation is, what do we need to do to solve the challenge of compute in the region? Is it again? What does, for example, what does a data center look like? Native African data center. What does it really look like? Is it the same kind of data center you have here in the States, in Europe, or is there a way that we can build and scale data processing in the region that isn't what we have today? Because what we have today was created. For example, Google created their data center architecture. It was a novel way of doing it where they were using off-the-shelf components to do it, right? And that was how they managed to scale it. Is there a different way to think about it, of creating compute in the region in a way that scales? Somebody needs to be thinking about that.
Yeah, I even think we're going into the wild, wild west of computing, right? So I still don't think the AI. I think OpenAI is definitely leading the race in terms of like the attention of the capturing the imagination of the public of what's possible with AI. But the field is so hot, and like as Zach said, what is currently seen as the state of art today, I don't think it will be the same by the end of the year next year. So I definitely don't think the frameworks to actually map out winners and losers is defined yet. I feel like we are still writing that out. For example, a lot of people are saying like this year small models might come into fashion and all these kind of things. For me, how I try to approach it is like all these things, it's technology. What problems are we going to be able to solve with AI that we couldn't solve before? And I think that's, to me, is what would define who the winners are and who the losers are. However, thinking from an African lens is very important, because this new world, this new wild, wild west we're entering into, I think Zach was the first person to ask me this question of if we had the opportunity to build an operating system or build a computer from scratch, would we build the same thing? So we're going to be asking this type of fundamental questions.
That is exactly what I was saying, right? Like somebody needs to be asking that question, like in the African context. Like if somebody was going to build a cloud in Africa, are you going to import the architecture that is used here? Or to your point, are you going to be thinking about it from scratch? Like, is it, and I'm making this of this crazy idea, but crazy ideas are allowed. Could it be a cloud of mobile phones? Right?
That's not crazy. That's an
right?
idea.
So things like that. Those are the kind of conversations that folks, I think, should be having at this point.
Absolutely. And just one thing to add to what you said, Emeka, it's like, and that's also one thing I hope as a community, or I hope as Africans, we get into the habit of, it's like accepting the reality that nobody will solve our problems. And I think that's why I love ADTC. It's like, let's look at our problems and see how we can solve, however you define how we can solve our own problems. And from the context of, we can't keep, or not we, like, it's not just about asking the questions, right? The best way to answer the questions is to actually build stuff, right? So if we as a community can, because to be honest with you, no one is going to give you the future. You have to build your way into the future, right? That's how we can get leverage. It's not by what we say or the type of questions we ask. It's like, what are we building? What experiments are we running in our markets? What insights are we able to derive, and how are we able to capitalize on the insights we've gained to actually build whatever we want to build? If it's a business, they are building a business. If it's a foundation, they are building a foundation. Like, guys, think about it this way. I'm so excited about what the future for Africa looks like, because, like I said, with this wild, wild west, there are no standards. No one yet knows what the protocol for doing AI and all this kind of things should look like. And that's why it blows my mind when some people are talking about, okay, they want to write legislation or like talk about how they want to like rule or legislate AI. This thing is being worked on. So the best way to get in is to build something. It's like, if we're in the internet era, right? The best way is to actually start building your website. Yeah, you don't know whether your own website might be Google, but the best way to do it is just imagine if exactly back when there was no Google was just starting out, right? If someone was already building like a website for connecting African universities, do you understand? So that's where we are now. We have to start building, and that's why I'm really excited about the potential for ADTC and how we can contribute to enabling more builders in the community.
No, that's definitely like the next wave, right? I know we had this conversation, and Like this is the year. 2024 is the year where we're going to be fingers crossed, where we're going to be activating a few of those plans. Obviously, some of them too early to share on the podcast, but yeah. So this is the year. We're heading there. We're heading there. But I did have a question for Zak. Zak is not going to escape.
So quiet.
Zak, what is your
Thank you.
own prediction?
Thank you.
What's my prediction? My prediction is the only sure way to predict the future is to build it. And so kind of the question turns back to what are we building this year, right? Because I think the first year was building the core community, and we have a healthy number of people that show up, although it's super early for some time zones and super late for others. We're definitely expanding the kind of the in-person attendance and like keeping that close conversations going. But clearly now, like, this conversation is recorded, and hopefully we're gonna publish it, so we're building more in the public. What does that mean? We're gonna have sort of these meta conversations, like what's the community doing, like what are the updates, what are the key highlights and things that are going on. But also maybe this can be a forum to invite people, dive into topics from kind of an interview style perspective, as opposed to what we currently have, which is lecture mode. For the most part, lecture, and then you have Q&A and conversation and so on. So I think it would be interesting to actually have an interview style, maybe dive into news, maybe dive into specific topics. Maybe I don't know how this thing is going to go, but I feel like part of growing this thing and recruiting content, but also members and so on, is to do part of it in public, and maybe we can externalize the learnings in public, and maybe we hope to bring some value out in public. So that's I think is a big theme for ADTC in 2024, and yeah, there's going to be in-person events and other fun things.
But you skip the main question, which is what technologies are you excited about in 2024? That's what I'm interested in here.
I'm excited at the intersection of AI, Web3, and culture. And mostly, how do these things come together to, instead of sucking the life energy out of humans, how can these technologies empower people, and how can they create more value? So the value creation of these technologies is something that I always stress on, and that's also why I keep asking the question about, or kind of like probing the use cases question. Have we actually found the right use cases for AI, or are we just going in another random cycle of people chatting with computers until people realize like, oh, they didn't want to chat to computers, and move on? Because it's starting to feel like a bit of that, and it, as much as there is behavioral change, the behavioral change is not going the way it is empowering people. Like for example, big part of it is not that much content is being written by people, and so if you don't try it, if you don't proofread, then you're basically externalizing parts of your brain to the computer. And so depending on whether that is intentional or not, I feel like there are muscles that we might actually start to lose. Like Photoshop, for example. Maybe some people used to love to hack around and like just do random Photoshop work just for fun. How much of that is being done after generative AI? I don't know. Like honestly, like for me, I can count twice since 2022 that I opened Photoshop or Figma or something just for the sake of doing something random. Because it's almost like the big part of the creative act has been offloaded to generative AI tools, and how that impacts, how it impacts the creation itself. Like how are people being creative or not when you input these technologies? And so kind of the broader question is like, how can you look at these things? Like how can you probe these behavioral changes? Like how are our behaviors changing in light of these new technologies? And what are the course corrections that we can make in real time? Because if it goes undiagnosed, we might actually end up in the same situation as social media post 2012 and post 2016, and pretty much like every 4-year cycle, where we have to relive the reckoning. Like, oh my god, like this thing is changing society. This thing is destroying civilization. This thing is destroying teens, and we had to say it before, and now like we have to say it when it comes to attention span. Like short form video is impacting people's attention span overall, and it's almost like we have collective amnesia, and we just don't want to look at the thing for what it is until it's already too late. The behavior has already changed, and we just move on. And so my point is, behavior already changed a couple of times just in the past 10 years, or maybe like if you start from the mobile revolution, and now we're changing that behavior even more. Like we're talking about companies laying off employees because they have found efficiencies in AI. Like this, it's mind blowing to me. So yeah, how can we shift the balance in a way that's productive, as opposed to kind of like be carried carried away with whatever new technology comes along. And then like we were just collectively scared from it, like, oh my god, like it's going to destroy civilization. And then you regulate it, and once you regulate it, you just regulate the innovation out of it. The value was captured by the incumbents, and it becomes just additional hurdles for the newcomers to create anything meaningful.
Man, you left us with a lot to think about. I'll say two things. Hey, that's why I love the ADTC conversations, or the multidisciplinary nature, right? Because like what you touched on now is not so much tech as it is like sociology and I'll call the softer side of tech, which is almost like, if not more important in many cases. And these are also conversations, like those cultural aspects of it, are things we really need to think about. As you are talking, and there's a plug to say that in ADTC everybody's welcome, right? Regardless of discipline, whether you're a musician, a linguist, a sociologist, whatever it is, so long as this conversation around Africa and deep tech and the future of technology and how it impacts all of us and how we can shape it is of interest. That's the key thing. But as you were talking, Zach, I was just wondering, when you talked about Photoshop not being a thing anymore, I was asking myself, do I miss that?
That's
it's just like I guess, yeah, with every technology, there's always that conversation of what it takes away, right?
I don't know if you guys can remember, as you were just speaking, Emeka, I also had a flashback of like I think GS1 or so in high school in Nigeria, we had to memorize 4-figure table. Do you guys remember?
Exactly. Yeah. On a log table, using the log table to do multiplication.
Yes. Oh my God.
And it was a whole art form, like you had to learn how to use the log table.
That's so true.
That was learning how to use the log table was a module, itself in class, right?
Absolutely.
Before you can even actually do the thing. So I think that's the line of these technologies and how they affect us. That's a line. There's a blurred line there somewhere. I guess the question then is, whatever space that was freed up, whatever space in our brain that is freed up by this technology, what do we apply that space, that capacity, that extra capacity for, right? So, to your point about attention span and short videos. Okay, so if short videos are the thing now, and we have, I'm making this just like a hypothesis, right? We have all the information crammed that used to be a 2-hour video, now somehow delivered in a 1-minute video, right? Do I use that time to watch 1,000 more 1-minute videos? Or do I use that time saved to go do something else, right? I guess maybe that's the question. So if AI is going to make us more efficient, right? What do we use that extra time savings for, as individuals or as organizations, right? You lay off the people who, you lay them off, or is there a way to repurpose them in a way that brings more value to the organization? I guess these are all part of the questions that we'll all be experiencing together as we go into the Wild West, as Baba said.
Yeah, at the extreme limit of what you're talking about, there is when you have artificial general intelligence, and it would replace the individual and be able to have decision-making prowess and do things that a normal human would do. And kind of in this thought experiment you have, all right, like, well, corporation, like just imagine like a normal corporation. What is out there to prevent a corporation from just doing that? There's absolutely nothing. Like, if you can get to a state of extreme efficiency, like, why would you trade that for like human flesh? So maybe the question is actually like looking at these governance systems and what they stand up for.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And maybe when we start doing that, we'll start to see that they're not optimizing for the human. They're optimizing for some abstract and godly thing. And that is, like, you just have to extract as much value from the system as possible.
Sorry, Zach. As you were speaking, I just had this vision of like, I don't know whether it's going to a utopia or a dystopia, of like an organization, and they just keep firing their employees, and then each employee lay off route, it's like stock prices just keep going up.
Yeah.
They keep firing until there are only like 10 people left at the company, but the stock price is off the roof, and then it's like, well.
But then where does that end? So who becomes the last person? Who's the last before the AI fires the CEO, right?
Yeah, if you squeeze all the value out of a system, you will eventually end up squeezing the system itself.
Yeah.
But you
Well,
wouldn't
I
realize
guess the
that until
question was-
before it's too late. Like
It-
all of us know the. Sorry.
No, I was gonna say it's a question of let's play this out to the end, right? And just see. So let's say there's this company like Baba said, they keep laying off till the last person, who's the CEO, who is in charge of this AI, right? And then at that point, I'm asking myself, so you're laying people off.
Actually, sorry, Emeka, just interrupt. It might not be the
Yeah.
it might not be the CEO that's the last standing guy. It might be the chief scientist.
The chiefs are okay, even better, right? Right? Even, oh my goodness. So it's the chief scientist that is the last standing person, right?
Yeah.
So, but then one thing we're not thinking about is all the people who are being quote unquote laid off. Where are they going? Like, what becomes of them, right? So, like I said, the human capacity that is being freed, what becomes of that capacity? Now, it's either everybody just goes and sits in front of the TV watching Netflix, right? Or whatever, right? And growing obese and just, or that capacity gets redirected to something else, right? So it may well be that at some point, and of course, this is an experiment, so we're taking it as far as possible. Like having a company or the idea of a company might not be the in thing anymore, right? Just the same way humanity moved from, being the feudal era where people were, cultivating lands for, landowners to companies somewhere around the 18th century or thereabout, right? And now we're in this era of having these corporations. And only, I think people engaged in agriculture went from more than 90% to, I think in the US, it's now about 2% or something like that. It doesn't mean that they were not still eating food, right? But everybody has moved on to something else. So we may get to a world where these corporations, right, are all run by AI, but then everybody is doing some other thing. We don't know what that some other thing is just yet, but who knows? Yeah, but yeah, it's scary and interesting at the same time.
That's the $1 million question. What would the humans do? Maybe we have to go back to being farmers and bring agric lifestyle back in vogue.
Or go to space, man. Come on.
Yeah, thank you.
It's so I think this is at the core question of whether AI is good or bad, quote unquote good, quote unquote bad, is what is the thing that it would be optimizing for, but then kind of like the dystopian angle here is the AI is not making any decisions. I don't think there's going to be any point in time in the near future where there's going to be like, oh, sentient AI is making its own decisions. If anything, we might actually destroy ourselves before such thing happens, simply because the AIs, like the people that are programming the AIs are optimizing them not for the right things, but not intentionally. It's not like someone is acting behind scenes, like saying like, oh, I'm gonna program this LLM to do this or that. No, it's just gonna be emergent negative behavior, similar to how like we've seen the emergence of negative behavior for social media or for short-term video or for porn on the internet or like any sort of negative behavior. Like it's very hard to study pre-mortem. It's very hard to study before we have like the massive civilization scale backlash and kind of like oh shit, like this is the output of having this type of technology. The most of the world actually was not exposed to the first cycle of how social media started to change geographies, and that was in 2012-ish or 13 with Arab Spring, or maybe even before. God, I don't know. When did that happen?
Arab Spring, was it?
Yeah, that was
2011.
That was before 2011.
2012?
2010
No.
technically they say start date.
It was around
December.
2010,
Yeah.
2009.
2010 to 2012. So there was a period of 2 years or so, or 3 years, and plus some aftermath. That was complete chaos. And if you are not living in one of the affected countries or the neighboring countries, like 5 or 6 of them in North Africa, it's like you have you have all of North Africa. You wouldn't know what's going on. And so for some, like I got to experience that firsthand and see how a seemingly normal website, there wasn't even a mobile thing back then, a seemingly normal website that has events allows people or gives people the potential to actually organize in real world. And Zuckerberg back in Palo Alto did not build Facebook thinking that it's going to be used by some people to overthrow governments and change their the makeup of their countries and elected officials and so on and so forth. Like no, like nobody thought about those side effects. But once you put certain things in an environment that is, like it's been historically repressed for different reasons, you start to unleash what could have been like those seemingly emergent negative behaviors, which are not necessarily negative. It's just it disrupts the system.
Disruptive, yeah.
Disruptive, and so kind of Silicon Valley is all about disruption, but we miss the fact that this when disruption happens, it is not something that we can control. Like you don't decide to disrupt the world without like having to deal with side effects of such disruption. So kind of like the question is, or the thing that I'm trying to put under the Microsoft is this question of like, what is the disruptive effect of AI? Beside AI is going to kill everybody and it's going to take over jobs and so on, which is kind of like at this point, I feel like it's much closer to a meme than reality.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is with if history has shown anything is that these technologies, at the end of the day, the way you think it's going to disrupt things is never the way. It's never the way it is. And
Absolutely.
that's one. And two, you can only tell when the disruption happened in hindsight. Only very few, maybe that's not true. Most people can only tell when it happens in hindsight. The people who know when it has, who are able to tell when it's happened, usually, like even at that time, nobody's listening to them, right? Like it's the same thing with the internet, it's the same thing with mobile phones, it's the same thing with smartphones, it's the same thing with, a lot of the stuff we're doing, right? So, like even this generative AI revolution that we're in now, the seeds were sown many years ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's only in hindsight that maybe some person who's writing the history of generative AI is going to
Connect the dots.
connect the dots and say, this is what happened, how it happened. So, yeah, nobody knows. Like I'm saying, the next disruption has already happened. We just don't know it yet. Like, we're only probably going to tell in like 10 years' time, looking back, right? So nobody knows when it has happened and nobody knows how it's going to happen. That's what makes it so exciting and so interesting, and why, to Baba's point, like the mindset now should be building by default. Like just build. If you think the idea is valid enough or the use case is valid or it creates value to you, put it out there and see what happens.
And I think a big part of the question of where are people, you're talking about we were talking about layoffs and said where are people that are getting laid off going to go. For the longest part, I had this, I don't know if I call it hypothesis or just like random thought, that is the amount of value that can be created by the sum of people outside a big, large organization is far superior than what the big, fat organization can create. And so kind of like thinking, like let's say Facebook, for example, or Google, for example, if you take the 100,000 plus people that make up Google today, and if you split them into teams of 10, you're probably going to end up with way far more value created out of the resulting community than it is created right now by the one giant company. And maybe we're going to get to a point over the next 5 or 10 years where we experience this, because I don't think there is a reason for big corporations to deal with the human overhead anymore, the same way there isn't a reason for humans to deal with the big corporation overhead anymore. It's almost like the excuse is no longer there. Like for a big company, they can leverage generative AI to replace XYZ jobs, but at the same time, those XYZ jobs can decide to actually create far more value by themselves outside of the environment, which is, again, I don't put it at hypothesis yet. It's still unformed thought, and putting it out there if someone has any rebuttal or any additions.
I think that's super interesting. As you're speaking, the only thought that came to me is like, what if the era of big companies is ending, or like super large corporations? But I know for sure, I firsthand have experienced a bunch of amazing people like who are in the job markets now. Right? But I think for a lot of people, they are also going through this shock of trying to rediscover themselves outside the bubble, right? So like, let's face it, like working at these companies has been a bubble, right? So like your Meta, your Google, like the culture has been a bubble. So, but the interesting thing is how this talent, how they play when they go into like what they do after, right? So I think that's the question. And the interesting thing is actually a lot of them don't want to do tech stuff anymore, Like I'm seeing a lot of people saying like, yeah, I'm done
We
with
need more
tech.
of that. We need more of the tech people doing non-tech stuff. Because that's
Yeah.
the only way to progress things.
True that. I mean, there is, again, it's that multidisciplinary thing, right? Bringing, that amalgamation of ideas. A tech person going into a non-tech space is immediately going to be thinking about, how can tech help here, right?
How to optimize, how to
How to
optimize,
Make more
optimize,
efficient
and
stuff.
all that,
automate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and ultimately that's going to bring a lot of amazing stuff, right?
We just ruin things, tech people. We show up,
Yeah,
like we just
yeah.
optimize the hell out of things, and we're like, oh my god, like we optimize ourselves out of the job. Oops.
Job done.
My
Do your
goodness.
job so well that you dig a hole for yourself.
Yeah. No, but
Oh, man.
I think another interesting thing I'm observing is, which is a great thing, is it's going to force tech people to understand people, right?
Mm.
Because it feels like, especially with social media, a lot of the people that built it, the way technologists think is very different from like, I know, like I know the bell curve Emeka did in our ADTC meeting, right? So like the people building technology, we are probably in the 20% of,
Yeah.
but 16%, sorry, 16% of like the global population, right? So now that we have been, at least let's say 8% of those people are being forced to go into and interact with the remaining percentage of the population, will their ideas about what they build evolve or change, or will it still remain the same? I think that's interesting too.
Not really. It's definitely going to change, just by the nature of what it is, right? And again, we'll see what it means for the region, right? Like a lot of, hopefully, and this is not to say, like, obviously, like being out of work is not anybody's first choice, right? But in terms of making lemonade, the hope is that with this, maybe there'll be a lot more interaction with the region, especially people, from Africa who are now in this space where they are able to look a bit wider afield, right? And that some of that brain capacity would go towards answering some of the questions we asked earlier on in this conversation. Yeah. And I guess that's also like maybe using this opportunity to say, like, if there are folks out there who may be listening to this and who want to be in a space where they want to bounce off some of those crazy ideas, ADTC is a good place to at least come and have some conversations and, and see how it goes. Or at least listen to some conversations, even if you're not happy.
We'll leave it on this high note. Emeka, Baba, thank you for joining. This was, I guess, episode 1. Maybe start from 0. No, let's start from 1. This was episode
We
1.
did it.
Of our maybe weekly, maybe bi-weekly. We'll see how this goes. Until next time, take care and thank you.